You're very welcome.
Well, appreciate your help, because God knows I wouldn't be able to figure any of this out.
I think you could, but it's okay.
It's just a little bit complicated for some of us folks, but I know how to click on a link, so that's my expertise, right?
You got it.
And you get the camera to point at you instead of at the only top half of you.
Well, the truth is, Ann, that the top half of me is really my best view. So
you're doing that on purpose?
It's really deliberate. So, let's just keep it that way, okay? You don't mind?
Yeah, but how can I?
And please take my word for it.
I believe you. I want my whole face to show, and I don't know how to do it.
Hello, Deborah.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
Thank you.
Glad to have you on. Okay, so we are up to chapter 4 of Pirkei Avot, Mishnah Chavtet, number 29. And this is another teaching of the fellow we met in our last class, Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. And in this teaching, he says, those who are born will die. Thank you very much. Those who are dead will be revived. That's what you would call the chiddush. That's the key idea of this. Right? And he goes on to say, the living will stand in judgment to make it known and have it acknowledged that it is God, the designer, creator, discerner, judge, witness, and plaintiff, who will render judgment in time to come. God the exalted, with whom there is no iniquity, no forgetfulness, no favoritism, and no bribery, for everything belongs to God. So Rabbi Elazar HaKapar is really giving you his whole theological statement here, everything about God and the afterlife. Let it further be known that the judgment is based on an accounting of one's deeds. And let not your imagination assure you that death will provide you with an escape from judgment. For it was not your will that formed you, nor was it your will that gave you birth. It is not your will that makes you live, and it is not your will that brings you death. Nor is it your will that someday in the future you will have to give an accounting and a reckoning before the ruler of rulers, the exalted one. In other words, all these things happen regardless of your own intentions and your own beliefs and your own desires. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And, as the old laugh-in line said, here come the judge. That's what's happening for all of us, according to Rabbi Elazar HaKapar. We don't have a choice in these matters. We will have to give an account for our actions. And the unstated conclusion of all of this for Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, but for him and for all of the rabbis, the unstated conclusion is a given. So we have to sort of insert that in. And the given is, so let us go to work. Let us get done what we ought to get done. The rest of the Mishnah and the Talmud tell us what it is that has to get done. And this life and the next life are a continuum. And we just, we have to expect that, and we have to gear this life accordingly. Now remember that these rabbis are the survivors after the last rebellion against the Romans. The temple is burned, the doors of Jerusalem are locked. So it might, to some of you, be a little bit surprising to hear that their message is and remains: take up the task of keeping the Jewish way alive and serving God, even when many of the old ways of doing so are no longer available. Now, Professor Jacob Neusner puts it this way. He says, you feel despair, so hope. You see destruction, so build. You see that everything has come to an end, begin it, renew it. Rabbi Reuven Bolka has a good phrase for this. He says, you have to be on your ethical toes all the time. And, the idea of judgment forces us to a level of responsibility and to recognize that everything we do, whether it's a mitzvah or a transgression, has ultimate value, and it's ultimately going to be weighed to our credit or otherwise. There's no bribery or deception in the really Supreme Court. And if you accept that everything has consequence, then you're more likely to be ethically sensitive and aware. Now, this teaching has a side to it that's kind of morbid, I think. Well, but even so, it shouldn't be daunting for all of you, right? Because you are the righteous. I mean, that's my expectation, right? Everybody here who is interested in learning Torah is righteous. And if you're righteous, then you should have no problem with a proper judgment, right? Well, a judgment that accepts no bribes, that doesn't allow for any favoritism. So for all of you righteous folks out there, this teaching is not just, it's not really a warning, it's an assurance, right? It's a promise. Now, for other folks, for the sinners, and we don't have, just by a show of hands, are there any sinners out there?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, please. Come on, Lou.
Yeah, plenty of them.
That's maybe a little bit, all right?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean, I have my problems.
Yeah, well, but not really big problems, right? So for real, serious, big-time sinners, it might be a problem, right? Maybe you don't want that kind of judgment. Where death is not the end, but the end, at least theoretically, could go either way. I don't worry about your judgment, Lou.
Thank you.
Now, just my own opinion. I could be wrong, but it's my opinion. Everybody in this room is righteous, right? But for some people, the end could go the other way too. So now, why do we need to have such a fearsome kind of teaching? Because, even though some people feel a certain amount of awe for God very naturally, and they recognize the wonder in God's creation, doesn't work for everyone. Some people just don't naturally come to that, and they need a reminder that they're going to be held accountable for what they do. So we should live on the side of good, because we know that one day we're going to be held accountable because a judge is going to bring us into the court. Now, the difference between this court and a human court is that we know that the judge loves us. The judge really cares about us, and the judge, we hope, will look favorably upon us. That's how we expect it to work. Now, the Maharal of Prague comments on this Mishnah, and he says, your parents die, and maybe that's how we realize that we also will die. But, he says, the dead will live again. Just as death is inevitable, so is the life afterwards. Judgment also is inevitable. And through all this, judgment is the link between the living people and the living God. He says, you will know and teach and make this aware. It uses 3 different expressions about this. Right? And why does it use these 3 expressions? He says, you will know it for yourself. That's number 1. You will teach it to others. That's number 2. And number 3, you will publicize it and make it aware to all. Right? And he also notes that this Mishnah uses a particular word for God. And the word it uses is the word El, Aleph Lamed. Right? He says, this name conveys the idea that God is the origin of everything. And how does it do that? Aleph is the first letter of the alphabet. Lamed is the first letter of the second half of the alphabet. And trust me, some things work better in Hebrew than in English. Right? Maharal is a mystic. And so he says, God is the origin of the higher world and the origin of the lower world as symbolized by the first letter of the second half of the alphabet. So God guides everything from A to Z, from Aleph to Tav. The Mishnah also uses an interesting word to describe God. It says God is Ha-Borei, the creator. You know the word Borei from Borei Pri Agafen, right? And there are many words that are very similar. You know the word Yotzer, as in the blessing Yotzer HaMa'orot, God who forms, who creates the lights. There's the word Oseh, as in Oseh Shalom Bimromav, God makes. Oseh Shalom, God creates peace. But Borei is a unique word in that it can only be used about God. Borei refers to something that is made out of nothing. And well, you can build a building, right? But you can't create your own spot, right? So this is the distinct understanding of God. God is Ha-Borei, the only one who can create something out of nothing. We're told that God has 4 different qualities as a judge. It says, before him, there is no iniquity, right? There is no forgetfulness. It says there is no favoritism, and God never accepts bribes, right? So that's all in the, I think, the second paragraph of this teaching. The exalted, with whom there is no iniquity, no forgetfulness, no favoritism, and no bribery. And the Maharal of Prague says these 4 qualities correspond to a verse in Parshat Yitro, where Moses' father-in-law tells him what to look for in human beings. He says, when you need to appoint judges to help you deal with all the disputes between the Jewish people, look for, number 1, men of valor, people who remember to save the oppressed. Okay, well, God never forgets. Right? Number 2, look for people who fear only God, meaning, they don't play favorites. And number 3, look for men of truth, no iniquity. And number 4, people who hate any unjust gain, meaning no bribes, right? And good judges should be like God in all of these ways. And those are very important. Maimonides also points out that this Mishnah talks about many of the ways in which life is determined for us. So many things are out of our control. You didn't ask to be born, and you'll probably die at a time that you didn't get to choose. And you'll have to give an accounting of your life. Oh well, back to that again, right? But not everything is out of our control, right? We choose the degree that we will live up to the standards of the moral law that God has given us, and that is how we are going to be judged, right? A few other points, and then I'll open this up to questions about the Mishnah. Rabbi Gordon Tucker comments on it that even God is constrained by certain rules. You know, to create a human being without free choice, without free will, that would be absurd. Right? And Rabbi Tucker quotes a mathematician, Raymond Smullyan, who says that many of us think of God as having some sort of paintbrush with which he daubs some creatures with free will and others without. Right? But free will is not an extra. Right? Free will, you know, a conscious being without free will is just an absurdity. Even God has some things that God can't control. You know, it's how we manage our choices that makes all the difference. Rabbi Tamari Lod Applebaum comments on this mission that it speaks first of those who are born, and then the dead, and then the living after death. It's like all the possibilities for human beings. There's birth, there's the trajectory through life, and then there's death and whatever follows that. And the continuation of the Mishnah tells us you might come to know and proclaim and accept that God is the Almighty. And you might recognize at every stage of life that God is real. And you might help support others, as well as other institutions, who help make God real within the community. Because by doing certain righteous things, you give God's justice reality within the community, and God's compassion as well. And finally, the Mishnah teaches us that before God, there is neither corruption nor forgetfulness. Again, Rabbi Tamari Lod Applebaum puts it this way. She says, this means that God serves as the loving, eternal witness to Jewish history. Nothing escapes notice, from God. Right? God is patient with humanity as we work our way through life. But the Mishnah says, don't think that the netherworld, Sheol, could be your refuge from judgment. Don't think that you can escape your mission as a teacher of and as a representative of Jewish values. You're stuck with that job, that you have to live up to a certain standard. As Heschel said, and this certainly has relevance to many events today, some are guilty, but all are responsible. Right? You may not be guilty for all the issues that trouble us today, but you're responsible for playing a role in fixing them. Let me open up the floor to comments and questions. You can either use the chat button, or you can unmute yourself if you haven't done so already, and ask a question at this time.
What chapter?
Please.
What chapter?
I'm sorry?
Which chapter?
This is the last teaching in chapter 4.
Thank you.
Yes, questions, comments? Yes, Roberto.
I think this is a teaching like we always thought that you have to be a good person during your life to have this judgment at the end that you don't even have control of when you get close to God, I mean, after death. Right?
Say a little more about that.
Well, always we are taught to be good persons, and that's the reason of that, because at the end of life, when you die, there's going to be judgment, and that's the teaching. So you have to be a good person, basically, during your life, so you have a problem for the judgment.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about the judgment, but what the judgment says about the way we have to live, the responsibility that we have to have for our actions, right? That we're accountable.
Right.
That's the message that the Mishnah wants to convey. Yes, Luke.
Danny, is there any structure to the teachings in all or any of these chapters that kind of bookends the beginning and the middle and the end?
Well, the beginning, middle, and end of what?
Well, if we go back and look at the beginning of chapter 4, for when Ben Zoma asks who is wise, those who learn from everyone, which, you know, we several weeks ago, months ago, we started with, and then we traveled through other rabbis. But is there, you know, was this compiled in the Pirkei Avot, were they compiled in a way that there's an introductory section of sayings and then a middle and then an end that kind of wrap anything up to a conclusion? The Amida has the introductory paragraph.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a very good question. And ultimately, I'm not sure that we really know for the entire Pirkei Avot, but let me speculate a little bit about this particular chapter of Pirkei Avot. So you mentioned the beginning of the chapter with the teaching of Ben Zoma about, you know, who is wise and who is strong and who is rich and who is honored, all right? So all of those are like introductory teachings about how to live, how to make, you know, some fundamental judgments about the nature of life, which incidentally teach us a little bit about how to live the life. And here with this teaching at the end of the chapter about Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, it's all about looking at things from the end point and saying, you know, remember that there's going to be a look backwards rather than forwards, right? And so, you know, make all your choices and live out your life in a way that shows that you take responsibility for that judgment at the end, right? Now, I'm not sure that this analysis really holds up, that there's such a strong connection between the first teaching and the last teaching, because there's so much in between. And the in between is all over the place, you know, like everything in the middle of life. All sorts of questions, and, you know, some of which are more philosophical questions, some of them are more practical issues, but at least it's a, you know, it's a possible answer to your question. Okay?
Okay.
But it's a great question, and that's really the best I can offer about it. the real challenge that I've tried to outline through last year and this year's course is about looking at Pirkei Avot specifically through the lens of the survivors, the people who lived in the period after the destruction of the temple and the reconstruction of Judaism that had to take place in that time. And now we're looking at the time after the second rebellion against the Romans in the year, that ended around 135, right? And that was when, there was really no more hope of an independent Jewish state for the foreseeable future, right? And so, there's tremendous emphasis on individual responsibility, less emphasis on communal responsibility, because the community as such was in much more flux than before. Other questions or comments? Okay, so let me just offer another couple of thoughts about this last teaching. There is, even though this talks about death and responsibility and reckoning, one of the things that we associate in Judaism with the very end is coming of the Messiah, okay? Because the coming of the Messiah is what's supposed to ultimately make the universe just, right? And, we know how broken the world is, and we know we can't ask God to step in and fix it all, but we also can't do it all by ourselves. So we have faith that in the long run it's going to work out, but sometimes we feel that God's not involved enough. And the late Rabbi Yehuda Amital taught that every generation has its own cry. Sometimes it's hidden and sometimes it's open, but we have to be attentive to the cries, whether they are open or hidden, right? So our job is to be aware of all the invisible people with hidden cries, people who are homeless, people who are enslaved, the victims that we don't see in our businesses or in shul. Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz quotes from the Talmud how during the festivals in Jerusalem, it was very important for people to see and to be seen. And he says that's really moral training for us, to be open to seeing those who are unseen. And that's the goal of our tradition and our rituals and our spiritual workouts, to see all people as equal, no matter how different they are. And that's really the first step to treating those people with respect and with dignity. So now let me move on to the beginning of chapter 5, right? Where we have a number of teachings that fit into patterns of 10, right? 10, of course, has its own significance in Judaism, right? What are some of the things we associate with the number 10?
Commandments,
10 commandments. What else?
sayings at the creation.
10 things at the creation. That's the subject of the first mission in this chapter. What else?
Well, the next two sayings have to do with 10 generations between Adam and Noah. And
Yes,
Noah and
yes, and we'll see the others. Anything that's not in this list that's significant connected with the number 10? What's the first letter in God's name?
Yud.
Yud.
It's 10.
Yud is the 10th letter in the alphabet, and as such represents the number 10. Though the number 10 is considered like, shorthand for God itself.
Oh, Sephirot.
I'm sorry. And if you are coming back for the next class at noon, you'll be thinking about the 10 Sefirot, the 10 different emanations through which God makes God's self manifest to the world. Okay, so let's look at this first teaching, which says that the world was created by 10 utterances. Now, what this means specifically is that if you go back to the first chapter of the Torah, there are 9 times where it says, and God said. Okay? 9 times in the first chapter it says, and God said. Right? So, through God's word, there was some creation. And the rabbis add to that the expression, Breshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Was just assumed that was also kind of a verbal statement of creation, right? So that makes 10. So that was the belief of the rabbis, that the world was created by 10 utterances. But, God has a lot of talent. If God had wanted to do that, God could have created the world just all at once with one statement. Let it all be, right? So what do we learn from the fact, asked the Mishnah, since this all could have been created through one utterance, what significance is there? What is there to be learned from the fact that God created the world through 10 different utterances? It teaches us that the punishment of the wicked who destroy a world created by 10 utterances is multiplied, while the righteous who preserve a world created by 10 utterances are richly rewarded. Right? So, God created the world and everything in it, and there's a progression in the story of creation. Right? One of the things about the progression of creation is that the human being is the crown of creation. Everything in creation is for our sake. Humans are more important than things, and that's why human beings are created after things. And we're more than just animals. The animals are created first, and then we come in at the end, and we are the crown of creation. But there are people who downgrade the importance of human life. As Rabbi Reuven Boka puts it, a haphazard creation would have legitimized a haphazard approach to life. And that's why the world is blessed with a progression. And by affirming the importance of human life, we join ourselves to God's design. But God's design, as we saw at the end of the last teaching, God's design also includes responsibility and judgment, right? And so we have to accept that there are going to be consequences for our action. If we take the right actions, right, then the reward is increased proportionately. And the same thing is true with judgment if we don't do the right thing with our lives. Right? By the way, the Maharal of Prague gives a different answer to the question of why God created the world with 10 statements. He says that 10 is the number of holiness in Judaism, especially because of the 10 Commandments. 10 resonates with the glory of God's presence. And God enhances the importance of the world by associating it with 10 statements. You know, yeah, you could have created a world through one statement, but it wouldn't have been as holy as it was through the 10 statements, right? Rabbi Mark Angel notes that destroying and sustaining creation can be understood in two different ways. It can refer to the physical treatment of the natural world, caring for the environment, taking care of the ecosystem, or it can also refer to spiritual life, you know, good deeds, devotion to God, and to God's creation, all help sustain the world. Those who destroy the world degrade a creation that took God's power to establish. We need the physical world for the spirit. If the spirit goes wrong, then we can destroy the world that sustains us. As I mentioned before, the number 10 represents the letter Yud, representing the holy name of God. And the Maharal says the message behind the 10 statements of creation is that the world is infused with God's name and with a high spiritual quality. Just as a human being is infused with a soul and with a sense of purpose, a higher purpose, so the world itself is infused with God's holiness. And so there are real consequences for maintaining a world with that divine element within it or causing harm within that world. You know, if the world were just a purely physical entity and had no spiritual significance, then it could have been created with just one statement. Would have been a casual action on God's part, almost capricious, right? And there'd be no consequences for whatever happens to it, right? Now, there's also another significance to the number 10, which no one has mentioned yet, and that is tithing, right? The notion that one was supposed to give 10% into tzedakah, right? So tithing for our rabbis was the thing that made our world whole again, right? You know, whatever was broken or whatever just, you know, wasn't right in the world was put back together through tithing. And so, says the 19th century Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, 10 is the first number that is truly suggestive of wholeness. Maybe that's why we also need 10 for a minyan, right? Because without that, we don't have a whole community. Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum suggests that if creation came through 10 utterances and revelation came through 10 commandments brought at Sinai, then the number 10 is a symbol of challenge that's given to every person, to every Jew. And the challenge is to be present with the God who is God for every person and every Jew, and to see the image of God in other people and to carry out the vision of God's Torah in every encounter that we have wherever we go. Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz notes that when God began the process of creating the world, God spoke, but without creating a finished product. The world continues because creation is ongoing. And so we should understand the power of our own actions and speech and the effect that they have on others. You know, our words and our deeds have an ongoing effect in the world. If our words and our actions sustain life, it is as if we had saved the world, or even perhaps built a new world. So these are a few thoughts about the first Mishnah in this chapter. So let me open it up for questions at this point.
I wanted to mention something that was interesting, because you're talking about the minyan that has to be 10.
Yes?
Is this how it created the minyan? Because it's an interesting point why it's 10. The minyan is not 11 or 12 or 13 or whatever, or 5, or any number. The minyan, I mean.
Yes. Well, the original reason for having 10 as a minyan was derived directly from a verse in Scripture. Right? So if you remember the story of the 12 spies who spied out the land of Canaan, you know, Moses sent a representative from each tribe. Right? And then 10 of them come back with a bad report. Right? Right? There's Joshua and Caleb who come back with a very realistic and encouraging report, and the other 10 come back with a kind of a sissy report, right? And so God's response to that is, how long shall I put up with this Edah Ra'ah, this evil congregation? Okay? Really uses the word congregation, Edah, right? And it's and so who were the people of that congregation? They were the 10 spies who brought back the bad report. So that's how they derived the connection between a minyan, a congregation requiring 10. Okay? So anything that is, you know, added to that about the significance of the holiness inherent in the number 10 is really an add-on to that derivation. Okay? Yes, Anne.
The normal human has 10 fingers.
Yes.
Our whole number system is based on that. I mean, there is a base 12, but we use 10. Surely that has something to do with it.
Yes. And the Kabbalists also expressed it that way. There is a Talmudic story in which, at the end of his life, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, holds up his hands like so, and he says, I took nothing for myself. Okay? And the Kabbalists all say, well, yeah, that's because you were connected to the 10 Sfirot. You were directly connected to God. Okay? And that's why you experienced the level of holiness that you achieved in your lifetime. The Kabbalists, you know, to be connected with God was through some understanding of the tree of life and the 10 Sfirot through which God emanated God's self into the world. Yes, Richard.
Rabbi, we were just talking about 10 trials for Abraham, and it says Abraham withstood them all. Now, first, I'm not sure I can remember all the 10, but my question is, what does the word withstood them all? Does withstood mean he put up with them, or he passed some of them, or what does the word withstood mean?
I'm not sure where you are.
I'm on page 252 of Lev Shalom, and I'm 5.4.
Okay, well, we're not there yet.
Oh, okay.
But I'll tell you, withstood means, he literally, it says, Ve'amad bechulam. He stood up to all of them. In other words, he met the challenges.
That's a challenge.
Okay? So we're going to come to that. You know what?
We were just talking 10.
Yeah, we're going to take these one at a time.
All right.
Yes, Lou.
The ancient Mesopotamian numbering system was not based on 10.
Yep.
It was based on factors of 60. Yeah, I don't want to get into a debate on this, but just, Ann mentioned we have 10 fingers. Of course we do. And our basis for counting and the metric system is based on 10, but it wasn't always that way, and it's not in every civilization.
Oh, absolutely right.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Any other comments or questions before we go forward?
Yes, Rabbi.
Please, Chris.
On your last statement of creation is ongoing, would you elaborate a little bit more how our words, thoughts, and deeds affect creation?
Right, so, in Judaism, each person has a certain responsibility for continuing the creation that God began, right? We're handed a certain world, which is a combination of God's creation and what everybody else has made of it, right? And we're given the responsibility for adding to that, for being co-creators. This is going to take us a little bit far afield, but it's a point that I think is worth mentioning, one that was elaborated on by the Dean of Modern Orthodoxy in 20th century American Judaism, by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And that is that there are really two stories of creation. And in the first story of creation, Adam sort of receives the world as it is. Adam is given just the, he's put in the Garden of Eden, and there it is, right? And you get the benefit of it, and it's all yours. But the second story of creation is a little bit different. There, Adam is given some responsibility for the Garden of Eden. His job is li'ovda u'lishamra, to till it and to tend it. And so, there's this combination, really a synthesis between these two parts of the creation story. You're given the world, but you're also given some responsibilities in the world. Right? And that's what we are left with. Okay? Other comments or questions? Okay, let me go a little bit farther. And I want to take number 2 and number 3 together. Just from the 10 statements of creation, we go to the first 10 generations of human beings in Scripture, and then the next 10 generations. 10 generations from Adam to Noah, demonstrating the extent of God's patience, God's forbearance. All these generations continually provoked God until God brought the floodwaters upon them. And then 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, also demonstrating the extent of divine forgiveness. All these generations continually provoked God until our father Abraham appeared and received the reward that they had lost. Right? So the first question about this is, why is God so patient? Right? And the answer that Rashi gives to this is, God hopes that people will repent. Right? And we should also say today, don't be surprised that God is patient also with the wicked in our own time. Don't be surprised that God doesn't respond to terrible things immediately. Right? After all, there's a precedent for God's patience. It doesn't mean that there isn't judgment ultimately. So why 10 generations from Adam to Noah? Right? These generations that forget about God's instructions and God's plans to the world. So as long as there was legitimate hope for repentance, God put up with it. But at a certain point, it's not reasonable for God to hope anymore. And so he makes a fresh start. And this was so radical that even God acknowledged he should never do that again. Whenever I teach about this segment of the Torah, I mention an article that was written by my teacher, Dr. Byron Sherwin, Alav Shalom, who wrote an essay called Portrait of God as a Young Artist, right? Suggesting, God's initial creation just didn't work out so well. It was a piece of art, but it wasn't really a success. And so God had to sort of dump it and start afresh with a new generation. And these are two sets of 10 generations in which God is patient. But the difference is that until Noah comes along, God was just waiting for someone worthy to survive, so God could get rid of everyone else without completely destroying life. Abraham's arrival is different. Abraham's arrival is the trigger for God to enter into a covenant with a worthy person. And the family of that person then acquires the responsibility to be a blessing to the entire world. And that is where we come in, right? Rabbi Gordon Tucker suggests that there is a very good contemporary lesson here as well. God is patient. God waits for 10 generations before stepping in. And maybe this is how we should judge things when it seems that the world is totally corrupt, or Washington is totally corrupt, or Austin is totally corrupt. Take your pick. But don't lash out and seek to destroy everything. Hope for and work for conditions that will eventually banish the corruption. So patience is one of the highest virtues when it is used for the right reasons. Now, there are all sorts of trivial things that we want now because we're not patient, right? You're in line at the grocery, you're stuck in traffic, you're waiting for the rabbi to finish, or you're waiting for the fourth Kaddish in the service, or whatever it is, right? You've invested a certain amount of time into something, and you say, well, I'm done. I put in the time, and now it should be over. Right? God invests a lot of time in creation, but God gets disappointed because human beings are not able to handle our responsibilities. But God is patient for 10 generations. So why can't we have a little bit more patience for the things we need? Now, the flip side of that is that even though patience is a virtue, we shouldn't expect those who are burdened by injustice to model it. And here is what Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. wrote about that in his letter from Birmingham jail, the very famous letter he wrote. He said, "If I have said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and indicative of an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth and is indicative of my having a patience that makes me patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me." Okay? So patience is a virtue up to a certain point. Okay? But we shouldn't be so patient with injustice, and we should appreciate the impatience of those who suffer injustice and its consequences. Comments or questions up to here? Yes, Lou.
The ages, the length of life of the Noah and pre-Noah biblical characters were, without, I think with one exception in his line, more than 900 years old. I think one was 600 and some years old.
Yes, which again, if you choose not to take those numbers literally, they may be expressive of that very patience that God has in this period. Okay?
Okay, but after Noah to Abraham, you know, Abraham was 175, I think. Did those ages drop precipitously, or were they gradual in the next 10 generations?
It does drop precipitously in the period in between these two. Okay. And, you know, scripture doesn't give a reason for it, but maybe it's a way of saying God was very patient, and now I'm going to be less patient. I'm going to give human beings less time. And, let me put it to you another way, Lou. If you had the feeling that you were going to live for 900 years, right? Well, I mean, this could apply to any of you, but I asked the question for Lou, all right? So, you know, after you say, well, you know, that's great. I'm glad to get to live such a long lifespan. You might say, well, you know, I'm really not in a rush to accomplish anything. You know, I can spend my first couple hundred years, just, shooting pool and playing video games and just having fun, and say, well, I've got another 700 years or so to go out and get something done. And then, comes your 300 year, your third century of life. So, well, another 600 years, I'm not going to be in a rush. I got plenty of time. And so on, and so on. And if you have 100 years left, how much urgency is there in that? Right? So it's only when human beings get a significantly shorter lifespan that the need to use your days more wisely becomes sufficiently urgent. Okay? Our time is up for today. I hope to see all of you next week. Thank you for being here. And we will carry on from here, beginning with Mishnah number 4 at 10:30 next Sunday. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Rabbi. Thank you.